Thank you all for attending our last of the 3 lectures in this series called Our Common Home: Science, Nature, and Creation, to reflect physical science, the philosophy of nature, and theology of creation that Dr. Smith, Dr. Ramage, who spoke last time, and I have been focusing on in this grant that we got from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, their dialogue on science, ethics, and religion, pronounced Dozier program. They are a secular organization, but they have 3 or 4 grant opportunities per year for seminaries in the United States and sometimes even internationally to participate in different science and faith initiatives that they have. And this particular grant allowed us to hold this lecture series, but also allowed Dr. Smith, Dr. Ramage, and I to represent the triad, science, philosophy, and theology, to actually meet on campus and talk about how we would design a new undergraduate course called Our Physical World that will be offered. It's being offered in the spring. Actually, we already have 11 students, and then will be offered regularly as part of the core curriculum beginning in the fall of 26. So that was a big but very fun undertaking. It was really great to actually say, "Hey, let's do something interdisciplinary, and let's take 2 days to figure out how we want to do that." And then these talks that we're giving flow from that. It's what we learned, what we were thinking about, and it's all in the context of climate change and Catholic thought, hence the name Our Common Home, and taking from Pope Francis's language, especially on the issue of climate change and good stewardship. The church has really been a leader on that for a long time. Before there were all these political battles and discussions at the national levels, the church has been a proponent of teaching citizens what it means to be good stewards, not just of the planet, but of each other, of human dignity, how to initiate and set up just societies. And I would like to then introduce Dr. Smith. His talk is on Stewardship and Culture, a Catholic philosophical vision for our common home. He was very critical to what we did with the natural philosophy part, and he's going to talk today about the philosophical foundations of environmental stewardship. So, without further ado, I will turn it over now to Dr. Smith. We will learn a lot from him today.
So, first of all, we'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to attend this lecture, especially Dr. Stacy Trazankos for her initiative and securing the grant from the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion program that's funding the development of this new course. The Dozier program, as she mentioned, is part of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So, I want to express our gratitude to that organization as well. And I want to add that working with Dr. Trazankos and Dr. Matthew Ramage has been a real pleasure, and I think students will really benefit from this course material. By way of reminder, I will restate the goal of this new course. The goal of this interdisciplinary course is to translate the Church's magisterial teaching on care for creation into a transformative experience of the whole person. This work will include illustrating how theology, philosophy, and the natural sciences can be woven together in an interdisciplinary way that advances knowledge for its own sake while helping students cultivate the virtue of stewardship and refine the practice of apologetics. My goal for this lecture today is to offer some guidelines for navigating the many issues of faith and reason, and especially questions regarding the common good. The first part of the lecture will be an overview of the tradition of faith and reason in the Catholic context, where we generally find cooperation and harmony. The second part will focus on different paradigms for understanding the relationship between religion and culture and reasons for choosing one paradigm over another. The final part will focus on a key distinction pertaining to the individual and what most informs right action in the public sphere. Part 1, Faith and Reason. Historically, the Church's long-standing commitment to scientific inquiry is well established, with the founding of the many cathedral schools in the 7th and 9th centuries, and then the major universities began in the 11th and 12th centuries. These institutions were largely intended to educate the clergy, and yet their curriculum contained the full panoply of liberal arts, including grammar, mathematics, logic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Why were those fields included, we might ask? Well, because there was a firm belief in divine wisdom as the source of all creation. This medieval curriculum was the fruit of Augustine's vision of the liberal arts from his work on Christian doctrine that was written in the 5th century. Augustine argued that the various fields of learning should be taken by the faithful and put into the service of theology, much as the ancient Hebrews took the spoils from Egypt and put them to better use. Thomas Aquinas puts this issue more clearly in terms of the unity of truth, when he argues that, quote, it is impossible that the truth of faith should be opposed to those principles that the human reason knows naturally, unquote. With this firm principle, Aquinas took on the challenge of showing that Aristotle's well known argument for the eternity of the world was not demonstrable, but only probable. Aquinas' approach and solution would then serve as a model of how to deal with any perceived conflict between what is known by investigation by humans and what is known by revelation. In the modern context, Pope Leo XIII wrote in his encyclical Aeterna Patris, quote, "For since the mind of man, by its very nature, is capable of knowing the truth, it is impossible that the same truth should ever be opposed to itself. The more, therefore, that human reason, by the pursuit of the sciences, penetrates the secrets of nature, the more does it find that these truths harmonize with the truths of the Christian faith." Or as Pope John Paul II wrote in Fides et Ratio, 1993, faith and reason are not in conflict, but are complementary ways of knowing that can purify and enrich each other, helping humanity understand both God and the world. Unfortunately, the myth of the Church's opposition to science continues even to this day. A few prominent scholars, however, have attempted to argue against that myth with more comprehensive histories of science that give due attention not only to the many Catholic scientists, but more generally to the role that Christian faith has played in the development of science as a whole. Father Staniaki, a Hungarian born Benedictine priest, physicist, and influential historian and philosopher of science, held doctorates in physics and theology and authored more than 40 books. Father Yaki argued that the advancement of science owes a great deal to the Christian understanding of creation. A universe shaped by random events should not be comprehensible, but the mathematical intelligibility of the cosmos at every level can only be rooted in an intelligent cause. Father Yaki argued that it is primarily this belief in the intelligibility of creation that drove scientific investigation in every arena in the West. In his 1988 book, The Savior of Science, Father Yaki made a compelling case for the value of Christian faith, particularly the faith of Catholic scientists, which had been virtually ignored in the 20th century. The Catholic scientist does not wonder if the universe is intelligible, but assumes and eagerly expects nature to reveal her beautiful and wonderful structures with mathematical precision and aesthetic harmony. The greater the complexity in time and over time, the greater glory to the wise creator of it all. The universe, according to Father Yaki, is not a problem to be solved, but a revelation. For a survey of Father Yaki's work, I would also refer you to a wonderful book by Stacy Trasankos entitled Science Was Born of Christianity. In this work, she demonstrates that Christianity was not a hindrance, but rather provided the very preconditions for the birth of modern scientists. Interestingly, there has been a resurgence of interest and respect for beauty in determining the truth of various hypotheses, especially in theoretical physics and advanced mathematics. In 2016, physicist Anthony Z. of the University of California published his work, Fearful Symmetry: The Search for Beauty in Modern Physics, which tells the exciting story of how contemporary theoretical physicists are actively looking for beauty in the analysis of nature. In other words, beauty in the form of symmetry can be a reliable guide to truth. That same year, in 2016, Stephen Barr, professor of particle physics at the University of Delaware, founded the Society of Catholic Scientists, which has served to highlight the work of Catholic scientists by name in virtually every arena of scientific endeavor in modern times. In his book, Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, Professor Barr argues that, quote, scientific accounts of natural processes are never really about order emerging from mere chaos. They are always about the unfolding of an order that is already implicit in the nature of things. Order has to be built in for it to come out. Now, prior to the 1960s, the curricula of most every Catholic university included a range of courses on the philosophy of nature that covered the animate and inanimate world, psychology, and cosmology. Christopher Thompson, in his book, The Joyful Mystery: Field Notes Toward a Green Thomism, argues that within this context, the student was surely aware of understanding the human person within the broader framework of the intelligible order of the universe, as sustained by God and as both the first cause and its end. Unquote. Simply put, the divinely ordered cosmos was the explicit context for understanding the nature of the human person. After the 1960s, however, Catholic universities followed the path of most Western institutions of higher learning in reducing classic curricula in favor of a buffet approach that catered to student demand. We can date this shift to a particular conference in Land O'Lakes, Wisconsin in 1967, and the resulting document referred to as the Land O'Lakes Statement. This document was drawn up by the heads of several prominent Catholic universities, declaring a secular style academic freedom that ultimately meant freedom from church doctrine. The most direct result of this declaration was seen in the subsequent lowering of requirements in theology and philosophy for undergraduates. Whereas the typical graduate of many Catholic universities had 2 years of theology and 2 full years of philosophy prior to 1967, that average dropped to just 1 year only for each discipline in the 1970s. Thompson goes on to say that the shift in educational emphasis away from classical curricula, especially the neglect of the philosophy of nature, has contributed to what he refers to as nature deficit, whereby many students have effectively lost touch with nature. And we mistakenly refer to nature as something separate from ourselves. Holy Apostles College is part of a rather modest number of Catholic institutions that has been trying to reverse this trend and to restore a classical Thomistic education that seeks to impart a wisdom of the whole. This new course, Our Physical World, is a major part of that strategy. The great distinction to be understood, then, is not between man and creation, but between creator and creation. As the highest members of creation and appointed stewards, according to the book of Genesis, humans hold a special role, yet we are only stewards and not owners. In 1998, Pope John Paul II issued what would be one of his most influential encyclicals, Fides et Ratio, in which he affirmed the human intellect's order to truth. Pope John Paul II described the relation of faith and reason in terms of cooperation rather than competition. A quote from his prologue: faith and reason are like 2 wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. Unquote. Jude Doherty, the former dean of philosophy at Catholic University, remarked that Pope John Paul II was equally a defender of reason as well as faith. Knowing full well that the power of reason had been under attack by the skeptics and nihilists of much of the 20th century, Pope John Paul II reminds us in Fides et Ratio that philosophy prepares the ground for belief, insofar as philosophy can demonstrate the existence of God and disclose something of his nature. Philosophy, however, is left with a self generated longing for what she cannot achieve, which is wisdom beyond reason. It, quote, yearns for the infinite riches which lie beyond itself, unquote. In his book, Thomism in an Age of Renewal, Ralph McInerney argues that, quote, when we learn philosophy, or any area of human learning, faith in others is required, unquote. Such faith is temporary and not terminal, he says. We trust others because we hope to arrive at a point where such belief is overcome by knowledge. Citing Aristotle's famous dictum that it is necessary to believe in order to learn, McInerney goes on to say, quote, the Catholic then has the advantage that he is given advice by the Church on how he might best proceed in the study of philosophy. And the Church is a good deal more trustworthy than mere human agency. Beginning in the proper way is then not based upon the reputation of a spurious individual who may or may not have the student's best interest at heart. The image of the philosophy professor who makes every effort to introduce radical doubt and skepticism into the hearts and minds of college students is a very real and pernicious danger. It is far better to start with a realist philosophy based upon the truth about the human person and a confidence in the power of human reason to know the world outside the mind. As Thomas Aquinas writes, quote, it is clear that natural things from which our intellect derives knowledge measure our intellect, unquote. Or to state it differently, the true expresses the harmony or correspondence between reality and our intellect. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis follows this realist line of thinking by devoting much attention to the first part of his encyclical to making the case for the ecological problem, putting issues in context and showing their interrelations. In other words, we need to consider first the reality of things in the world in order to begin formulating a response to it. Moreover, Pope Francis connects environmental, social, and economic problems together in line with the deep heritage of Catholic social teaching. The central idea in Laudato Si is integral ecology, a term you have heard in both prior lectures by Dr. Trazankos and Dr. Ramage. The term integral ecology is best expressed in Thompson's book as, quote, the intentional practice of those principles of human flourishing that emerge from the reasoned pursuit of a hierarchy of goods, a pursuit that we enact alongside every other creature of the universe, a pursuit that is happily ordered toward goods that are perfective of us within our common home. So I want to take a moment to diffuse some of the concerns Catholics sometimes have regarding environmental issues. Some may be rather uneasy about the idea of our course focusing on the environment, especially as it involves climate change. Apart from a great reverence for St. Francis and his affinity for all things great and small, Christians are often reluctant to take a stance on environmental concerns due to the charged political discord regarding climate change. But that would be to define the problem too narrowly. The International Theological Commission wrote in 2009 that, quote, there cannot be an adequate response to the complex questions of ecology except within the framework of a deeper understanding of the natural law, which places value on the connection between the human person, society, culture, and the equilibrium of the biophysical sphere in which the human person is incarnate. Another important term that Pope Francis employs is our ecological debt, which refers to the evident misuse and disregard of the environment, which has effectively limited essential resources such as safe drinking water. He writes, quote, "Yet access to safe drinkable water is a basic and universal human right, since it is essential to human survival and as such is a condition for the exercise of other human rights. Our world has a grave social debt towards the poor who lack access to clean, drinkable water because they are denied the right to a life consistent with their inalienable dignity." Unquote. The notion of integral ecology is not by any means a new idea, however, but Pope Francis has surely framed it in a very powerful way in his encyclical Laudato Si. His predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, referred so much to ecology that he was sometimes called the Green Pope. His World Day of Peace messages in 2007, 2010, 2011 were especially forceful in clarifying the connection between environmental and moral issues. From his message in 2010, quote, "The environment must be seen as God's gift to all people, and the use we make of it entails a shared responsibility for all humanity, especially the poor and future generations. Further, we are all responsible for the protection and care of the environment. This responsibility knows no boundaries." Unquote. How we interpret this and relate to this idea, however, cannot be addressed without clarifying our relationship to culture in general. As Catholics, are we supposed to stand apart or participate? Do we lose or gain influence by participation? To address these and related concerns, I want to take a moment to introduce a helpful distinction from a book written more than a generation ago by Richard Niebuhr. His book launched a wide ranging discussion among both Protestants and Catholics about the relationship of religion and culture. Contemporary Christian environmental responses are often at cross purposes because they assume different models of the relationship between faith and culture. And I think Richard Niebuhr's typology can help us make sense of it. In 1951, Richard Niebuhr, a theologian at Yale, published his book, Christ and Culture, in which he described several paradigms for the relationship between religion, broadly speaking, and culture. While he offered 5 variants for that relationship, we will focus here on just 3 of them: Christ against culture, Christ of culture, and Christ above culture. First, Christ against culture. This paradigm assumes that human culture is irredeemably corrupt and sinful, and that Christian faith is best preserved by separation from society. This view is most clearly seen in the Anabaptist tradition in the 16th century and contemporary communities such as the Amish. Here we find radical separation and even disinterest in the wider culture. The second option is the other extreme, Christ of culture. This position sees a deep harmony between Christianity and the values of the surrounding society. Rather than challenging the wider culture, the believer offers a religious endorsement of whatever values are current. But if culture and popular opinion is the real authority, then whatever a community agrees upon will be what is assumed to be moral. Such a position can easily lead to a certain relativism, where ethical standards shift with majority opinion rather than being grounded in the natural law. The third conception, which for us represents the middle ground between the two extremes, is that of Christ above culture. Proponents of this view argue that culture is basically good and that religion perfects it as grace perfects nature. Church and society can exist in a harmonious yet hierarchical relationship. Here we find the natural law tradition of Thomas Aquinas. His integration of faith and reason, grace and nature is not one possible stance, but the normative framework. Culture, or the public square, is for Catholics not the domain primarily of individual moral choices, but rather an arena in which we find the communal dimensions of the Church's engagement with society. There is a key distinction, however, that undergirds these different conceptions regarding the relationship of faith and culture. That is the distinction between political and moral freedom. The former, political freedom, is defined by a lack of constraint on human action. In political arrangements, we give up some freedom to live within the context of an organized society and to do as we please otherwise. Moral freedom, by contrast, is what we find in the virtue ethics of the ancient Greeks, such as Aristotle's Ethics, and in the Gospels. This freedom is not freedom to choose anything, but a freedom to choose what is truly good and to flourish as human beings. This is the freedom to do and to be good. Only the Christ above culture vision can sustain a proper ordering of political and moral freedom, in which the political arena is supportive of actions that perfect the human person. In this view, Christian faith enters the public square to elevate and fulfill the natural ends of civic life. And this is why Catholic social teaching consistently draws attention to our responsibility for the poor and vulnerable, and yes, even the immigrant. This, quote, freedom for perfection is what we find in the Gospels and the Thomistic moral tradition. In the context of the natural law, Aquinas explains that the first principle of practical reason is the notion of the good, which is to say, good should be done and evil avoided. This point is also especially clear in the works of the last three popes. For example, in the encyclical Veritatis Splendor, 1993, Pope St. John Paul II writes, quote, "Authentic freedom is never from is excuse me, authentic freedom is never freedom from the truth, but always and only freedom in the truth." And another quote, "When freedom is detached from the truth about the human person, it becomes destructive to the person's own identity and to society. Freedom is not the right to do whatever we please, but the power to do what we ought. Our freedom has a purpose and is grounded in the truth of what we are, animals with a rational nature and a destiny beyond nature." Of all creatures, humans alone are cognizant of their purpose and can knowingly pursue it. Animals without reason have their end given to them, which we call instinct. They can neither rise above it or fall below it because they do not participate in real choice about the means to their ultimate end. Humans alone can rise above their nature and participate in divine life. Ironically, man is also unique in being able to fall below his nature and be less than himself and even like other lower animals. But to remind ourselves of a previous point, this insight regarding our destiny is not a story of how our political freedom may be employed, but rather of whether or not we will embrace our freedom for goodness and, in Socratic terms, exercise our proper function. But what is our proper function in creation? Are we lords who exploit as we please, or are we caretakers? Do we follow the stewardship model or the dominion model of Genesis? The Catholic tradition offers a conception of stewardship rooted in the dignity of the human person. This model of stewardship over creation comes from another Franciscan, the Franciscan, Saint Francis of Assisi. His conception of our relationship with creation is that of kinship, as both Dr. Trasankos and Dr. Ramich have noted previously in their lectures. St. Francis found his inspiration in the Psalms, where we find the members of creation, including the trees and the birds, sharing in their praise of the Creator. On that basis, some have argued for an equality of value for all living things, but that would be to misread our relationship with creation. To value other creatures rightly, we need not assume a leveling of value between species. There is good reason to think in terms of a hierarchy in creation. In his book Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, physicist Stephen Barr responds to this idea that concern for creation involves a leveling of value for all species. That there is something different about man is obvious. There is, quote, an enormous gulf between the capacities of human beings and other animals. He goes on to say, quote, animals do not spend their time wondering about their place in nature, or writing books about the cosmos, or doing research in physics, or build airplanes or ships, or adorn their bodies with clothes and jewelry. And they certainly don't contemplate the ironic or tragic elements of existence, or pray to God, or perform any religious devotions, or deliberate about communal or national laws, or engage in commerce. No matter how much we see animals communicating with each other or interacting even with other species, there is a great deal of activity that is unique to humans. Even cosmologists who are not themselves believers may be coming around to the all too evident fine tuning of the cosmos for human life, and yet even a beginner in biology can appreciate the astounding fine tuning of organisms and ecosystems at most any level. They are resilient and adaptive and exquisitely interdependent in very surprising ways. Mutualism is an interaction between different species in which each participating species gains a net benefit that enhances survival, growth, and reproduction. Examples include small remora fish that clean larger hosts such as sharks and whales, also pollinating bees and even bats in relation to flowering plants. But an even more interesting example of mutualism, however, is the behavior of crows and starlings, which are known to stand on ant hills to encourage ants to clean them, especially when they're unwell. The ants release fomic acid that kill and repel feather mites, lice, and other parasites. First documented by ornithologists in the 1930s, anting has been observed in over 200 bird species worldwide. So I take this rather mundane example as somewhat different from the many examples of one species finding a food source on another animal that also benefits the host. With the Andean example, we are faced with an intentional action on the part of the bird to invite a different species to help them and enjoy a benefit. In other words, both species benefit, but the one who initiates the action is not the one seeking food, which is the obvious driver of so many other interactions between different species. This is a more surprising level of mutualism at work based upon a real invitation of one species to another. A great example of humans engaging in mutualism of this type is our employment of bees. Each year, California imports about 2 million beehives for the annual almond tree bloom because the state is unable to support that number of bees year round. That's over 4 billion bees invited to help humans pollinate the almond trees, which is perhaps the world's single largest pollination event. We can't do this without bees. So, do you think humans have an interest in the lives of bees? Of course. We need them to flourish so that we can flourish. This is species interdependence. I am not proposing anting or the work of bees as evidence of God in terms of a gap in knowledge, however, that cannot be explained except by supernatural intervention. On the contrary, I am pointing to something marvelous and intelligible. This is not a God of the gaps approach, but rather, as what Dr. Trasankos made clear in her presentation, it is the God of the wonderful. The more we understand, the more we appreciate and are confirmed in believing in an intelligent creator who genuinely works through and with other agents. This is not a competition of causes whereby we must affirm the work of the creature or the work of the creator, but rather a cooperation of causes, primary and secondary. This insight is what Father Yockey and Professor Barr have both been pointing to. Just as the characters in the world do not compete with the causal activity of the author, so the astoundingly complex instinctive actions of animals do not compete with divine providence. Rather, the characters in the story, in this case, members of creation itself, bear witness to their intelligent author. The point of such examples is to emphasize the inherent teleology or purpose driven life of organisms, as well as their interdependence. They are not mere matter for human interest, but possess their own purposes and distinctive roles within the larger ecosystems in which we find them. The better we understand these roles, the better stewards we can be, and the better we can interact with the rest of creation for our own purposes as well. A healthy ecosystem is a very fruitful system. Of course, we can go too far down the path of highlighting the dignity of every life form. We may not need to relocate worms in order to prepare the ground for a building foundation, nor are we called to be vegetarians or live in caves. This is surely not the temptation of our time. The error of our time is quite the opposite. It is wanton destruction and manipulation of creation without foresight, without any concern for the consequences to the coming generations. As Pope Paul VI wrote in 1971, quote, "Man is suddenly becoming aware that by an ill considered exploitation of nature, he risks destroying it and becoming in his turn the victim of this degradation." Unquote. The earth is surely created for man, and yet that right of dominion must be forward thinking and not limited to present use only. It involves the prudential use of the goods of the earth. Let us consider for a moment what it means to say that creation is, quote, for us. Thomas Aquinas writes in his Summa Contra Gentiles, quote, "The ultimate end of the whole process of generation is the human soul, and matter tends toward it as toward an ultimate form. So elements exist for the sake of mixed bodies. These latter exist for the sake of living bodies, among which plants exist for animals and animals for men. Therefore, man is the end of the whole order of generation." Unquote. This is the conceptual world of Laudato Si. Pope Francis shines a light for our responsibility to cultivate the garden of the world. Cultivating means caring for, protecting, and preserving for the next generations. This responsibility involves respect for the laws of nature and the delicate equilibrium existing among the creatures of the world. The common good. And here we need to raise the question of our common good as well. In the Catechism, the common good is defined as, quote, "the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily." Unquote. This notion includes what must be in place, such as just laws, peace, access to basic goods, which means adequate food and water, and respect for human rights. It is not a utilitarian conception that aspires to the greatest good for the greatest number, but rather a framework that ensures the dignity of each person. Most interestingly is that children are not only considered key beneficiaries of the common good, but also are themselves a common good. What I mean by this is the children of today are the teachers, doctors, firefighters, government leaders, and business owners of tomorrow. The small child today crossing the street in front of you may end up being the emergency surgeon who saves your life in the not too distant future. Finally, the common good is best understood as both an ideal and a moral measure. As an ideal, the common good is that set of conditions that allows all persons to reach their full potential. This ideal includes quality public education, access to clean water and air, safe housing, and participation in politics. Historically, the foundation of the common good is found in the premise that man is a political animal, meaning that humans naturally live in communities and flourish in relation to one another. This is one reason why the ancient Greeks considered exile the punishment worse than death. In this view, the common good is not at odds with the personal good, but they are mutually supportive. This view also assumes a certain measure of trust and goodwill among the members. The demise of public trust in the government and banks and corporations, and yes, even in the church in recent decades, presents a serious challenge to our pursuit of this common good as an ideal, since everyone is distrustful of everyone else's formulation of what is in fact good for the whole. As a moral measure, the common good can serve to guide decisions even in times where trust is eroded. The notion of the common good may be a factor in deciding how far from work we may look for a house, what kind of car to drive, or how careful we are in sorting out our trash, or what kinds of plants or trees to use in our landscaping, or even whether to buy local produce. In other words, just considering how our actions impact others in the present and in the future is to allow the common good to measure us and our decisions. In that case, it is also evident that the common good is not a set of rigid affairs, but must be considered continually with each generation and by each community. To be clear, the common good is not the greatest good for the greatest number, or simply the interest of the majority. That way of conceiving the common good can support any number of pernicious laws, as we saw in Nazi Germany and the former Soviet Union, which served to silence and even eliminate entire social groups. Unfortunately, it is not hard to find such regimes at work even today. For that reason, the common good must be considered also in light of other political and social principles to prevent the common good from being merely the majority interest, as de Tocqueville warned us. In the context of working for independence from Britain in the 20th century, the Indian Mahatma Gandhi said that, quote, a civilization is measured by how it treats its weakest members, unquote. The guiding principle in Catholic social teaching has been the preferential option for the poor. It is the common good, if the common good is truly a set of conditions for the flourishing of all, then we really do need to pay attention to those who are most distant from that ideal. But what determines whether or not we can, in fact, know what is good for others and act on it? In other words, what is the best way to conceive and develop the common good as common? Some have even argued that we cannot rightly understand what the natural law requires unless we are rightly engaged with all others. Conscience and prudence. In Ethics Book 3, Aristotle makes a useful distinction between things we can deliberate about and things we cannot. The latter refers to such things as mathematics, logic, astronomy, chemistry, and so forth. We discover the truths of such sciences, but we do not create them or change them. Things we can deliberate about, however, are things that are up to us, things to be done. What I'm going to wear or eat, or what I'm going to say on this occasion, what major to take in college, or what kind of career to pursue, these are things up to us and therefore subject to deliberation. The most important category, of course, is that of moral action. When a person is confronted with choice between good and evil, or more rightly, between a higher good and a lesser good, the common good or my private good, the choice is surely more critical than what tool the carpenter uses or what type of pan to use in the kitchen. But how exactly do we make a moral choice? Or better, how do we guarantee the rightness of our moral action? And what is more predictive of success? The tendency to think rightly or to feel rightly about things? To answer that question, we need to make another distinction, namely between conscience and prudence. We know conscience in two ways, according to Aquinas. First, as a judgment made before we act, which prompts, directs, or guides. Second, we know conscience as it assesses what we have already done and gives rise to remorse or satisfaction. Generally, we are most aware of conscience in terms of hesitation regarding some action we're about to do, regarding shame or regret, or about something that has been done. In Plato's Apology, Socrates describes the experience as a daemon, not demon, but daemon, that held him back when he was about to do something wrong, but as otherwise silent in the face of right action and right decisions. Notice that it is not the doing of such actions, but only a judgment about them. In other words, the act of conscience is purely cognitive. A person can have a well formed conscience and fail to act at all, good or bad. A person can also have a well formed conscience and still perform bad actions. Aristotle describes this kind of person as the incontinent man or the weak willed man. St. Paul also describes this kind of experience personally in Romans 7 when he says, quote, I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good that I want to do, but the evil I do not want. Unquote. Anyone who has tried to start a new diet or a new exercise habit knows exactly what this experience is like. For that reason, we can say it's not enough to feel rightly about some moral action or known good. It is our actions that reveal our moral character. In his book, Ethica Thomistica, Ralph McInerney describes the problem in the following way. To speak of the good is to relate to it cognitively. To know it under the guise of truth is not yet to relate to it to the good as good. The good is the object of appetite. It is what we seek or pursue or aspire to. If the goods that are enunciated are not my goods, and if I am not effectively ordered to them as to the objects of my appetite, these principles are not, in the full sense, moral or practical principles. The moral virtues presuppose prudence about the means to accomplish the end desired, and yet prudence also presupposes moral virtue to guarantee that the end or purpose in question is a good one. In that case, we cannot acquire one without the other. My reasoning about moral action has to be tempered by a clear orientation to a good end, one that is truly perfective of me as human or perfective of the common good. And this is why Aristotle has a surprising line early in his Ethics, in which he advises the reader, quote, to pray that these goods will be good for you, unquote. And what he means is that these highest and best goods will be truly desired and sought as good and not merely as true. If, for example, a man recovering from a heart attack simply learns how his diet needs to change for a better physiology, he will not necessarily act on the advice. He will simply know cognitively that fish is better than steak or fruit is better than pie, but may quickly slip back into old habits. What is needed is a desire for better health and right reasoning regarding the means. Returning to our discussion of ecology, it is not enough to know cognitively that the natural balance of the environment should be protected, or that recycling is important, or that bees are essential for crops, or that quality drinking water is essential for human flourishing. What is needed is for such goods to become our good in the concrete human experience and not only in the abstract. This is the aim of Laudato Si, and this is the aim of our new undergraduate course, Our Physical Home. Thank you. So I want to open it up for questions. Let me start by sharing. Okay, I can see most people here. Bill, go ahead. You want to unmute yourself?
Thank you. Thanks for this. This is really compelling and absolutely important work here. Wanted to ask, about. I guess I think there's this tension I feel sometimes within the Thomistic tradition because on the one hand, it seems like when it comes to things like the values and goods that we intuitively feel like are exemplified in the natural order. But when we look at the metaphysical sort of stacking up with the human being, and then you've got the non-human animals and then the vegetative and then you've got inanimate matter. There's this long distance. There's this big distance metaphysically speaking between the human being and where we just intuitively feel where there's beauty and there's goodness.
Mhm.
And so I wonder though if there's an approach to that which says that rather than looking at the things, the matter, the objects, you're looking at the ranks of the values themselves. And I have in mind the phenomenologist traditions, Scheller and von Hildebrand, who think, who they argue that there is an a priori order of values and that beauty is a spiritual value. Beauty and truth and justice are all already you know, highly ranked. And so it really doesn't matter where things are in terms of metaphysics. What really matters is where things are in terms of value perception and value response. Because just because somebody, actually acknowledges that there's beauty in nature doesn't mean that they necessarily hold beauty to be a spiritual value. So I just wanted to kind of throw that thought out there.
That's wonderful. That ties into the idea of beauty as a measure of truth in physics and mathematics, and the idea that the whole itself is the measure by which we're trying to accommodate our explanations. Um, just as you can't explain a human body by looking at a number of different cells in the foot, you can't explain the cosmos by just looking at this planet or that planet. It has to be looked at in terms of the whole. Whatever fits, whatever is most integrated, whatever explains more of the data, what provides more understanding of the integrity, the order, the clarity of the whole, that's going to be the truth. That's where you're going to find the truth. So that's where you aim further, and that means you're on the right track insofar as you're looking for and starting to understand wholeness. To the degree that you reduce it, or to the degree it becomes granular, it becomes ugly and it becomes false. So I think that's entirely helpful. Right. Very good. Anyone else? Yes, Stephen. Yes, go ahead, Stephen.
Thank you for the talk. It was a great talk. My concern is in cases where, like, environmental goals foreseeably deprive the poor of, like, the energy they need, the development they need,
Mm,
family life through antinatalism and euthanasia, or the
mm,
freedom to act, raising, the risk that you're instrumentalizing their human dignity. So within
right,
the
right.
integral ecology framework, what is the principle that establishes the moral priority of the human person when there is a conflict?
Well, one thing we can't do is prevent other countries from developing the same way we have. So it can't be fair for developed countries to look at underdeveloped villages and say, "Well, you can't develop because you're endangering resources that we need." Right. So that can't be fair. So either the developed countries have to help them leapfrog those kinds of stages, or they have to allow them to go through those stages. I mean, for example, in Western Africa, uh, they didn't have much in the way of lines for telephones. And so they leapfrogged the entire infrastructure for telephones and went directly to cell phones. Um, and the same with faxes. The use of faxes in Europe was far more integral to their communication than it was in the U.S. So they leapfrogged some of the technology that we had, and it became more efficient. So how can we help, in other words, an underdeveloped village, nation, or economy get beyond that and not necessarily make all the same mistakes? Right. So we want to allow them to go through those stages of development, get to a way in which they can have plumbing in all houses, running water and electricity in all houses. We don't necessarily want them to go through every single stage in the worst way that we did, right?
Mhm.
Hopefully they can learn you can learn from the mistakes of others,
Okay.
but what I think would be an incorrect approach is saying they can't do it because we need their resources.
But
Right.
I was actually talking about I had an experience where someone was saying the protection of the common good is at an equal level as human dignity in Catholic social teaching.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
due to Laudato Si and integral ecology, that's something I just can't grasp as true.
Okay. Do you understand the way in which children can be conceived of as beneficiaries and part of the common good?
Yeah, but I can't
Okay.
see how
Okay. So in other words,
antinatalism or euthanasia or something like that can justify because of the ecology. I can't see instrumentalizing human dignity as
okay.
a
Okay. I don't.
as a
Maybe I'm
means to an end.
misunderstanding. I'm not understanding how you're thinking that euthanasia is actually for the common good.
Oh, well, you have like Canada. They're rationalizing healthcare by causing euthanasia because it's too costly
Okay.
to
So yeah,
to
that was the reason I brought in those other principles. That if it's just the common good, then you can rationalize getting rid of the Jews. You can rationalize getting rid of the gypsies. You can rationalize getting rid of anything that you don't like or any race that you don't like or any practice you don't like. And so that's the reason the common good cannot stand as a principle on its own. It has to be measured and guided by other principles, such as dignity of the ultimate dignity of the human person. That right away says euthanasia is not allowed, and the dignity of the human person is an inalienable good. Therefore, we can't eliminate entire groups, and that's articulated in the preferential option for the poor and the vulnerable. Okay. So once you have that balance in place, the common good cannot be used as a bludgeon to annihilate what is not comfortable and what is not easy. Right. So it can't. Anytime you hear arguments where it sounds like the majority is always it's just good for the majority, then you've got a problem because the common good is being used in the worst possible way. Yes.
thank you.
Very good. Anyone else?
Yeah,
Yes, Connor.
I don't know if
Go
you can
ahead.
hear me, but, given the emphasis in the Christian tradition on eternal goods, most prominently, the union of the human soul or person with God,
Mhm.
how would that, apparent infinite disproportion of goods, reconcile with integral ecology's incorporation of the goods of, non-human created goods in nature, which, to be clear, I quite agree with, but I'm just wondering how that squares, philosophically or
Okay.
theologically, I should say.
Are you asking about whether there is a hierarchy or whether and how the hierarchy works?
The latter.
Okay. How that would be getting into the details with regards to any kind of question and adjudicating that. For example, if we went back to the example, I mean, if we brought up the idea that I had about the bees, right? So if we want to use them, then we have to support them, right? So if they're important in the same way, if we want to protect the Amazon forest, well, we have to figure out to what extent we can need to be able to protect it, but also allow those communities around it to develop. Uh, So I'm not sure. Maybe you need if you had a specific example, but that's probably getting too far into the weeds regarding um, what we're trying to do here.
Or maybe I could frame it as would a non-human creature uh,
Mm.
or a finite creature, say a bee, have within this model a kind of intrinsic good, even if there's no what do you call it, relation scaling up of that good toward human goods in and of
Okay.
itself.
Okay, so that's probably what you probably have in mind is the fact that we've anytime there's a building project in the United States, they always investigate, is there some kind of species that's gonna be at risk? And if that species is only is endemic there and nowhere else, well, we kind of have to worry about that because what don't know, we don't know, right? So there's 3 things we have to worry about. Certain things we know we don't know. We're asking a question we don't know. But what we really need to worry about is the things that we don't even know we don't know, which is what happens if we get rid of this species? Or as we found with regards to the introduction of certain fish or certain plants in the United States, what happens if we bring it in? All of a sudden, it serves one purpose, but then it takes over the environment. And then you've got a problem on your hands because you introduced something that doesn't belong there. Right? So whether we introduce something or take it out, we have to figure out how is that going to change the balance of everything. Right? And
Sure. So would it? Oh,
typically the response is preserve what's there to the extent that we can because we don't know what's going to happen if we don't. Right? I mean, species go extinct all the time, but we're not sure what we're losing. Right? And to the extent that we don't know what we're going to lose, we try not to
yeah, as
as
a
much as
precautionary
possible.
principle that or prudential that makes perfect
Yeah.
sense. I was just wondering if that would cash out ultimately in a kind of instrumentalist good oriented toward human goods, given the eternal finite disproportion, or if there would be a kind of not intrinsic versus instrumental goodness in a kind of natural law sense through fiat for the bees as a species bracketed from human, even though you can't ultimately bracket it. I
Right.
understand.
Exactly. So I think I would just go along with Thomas and say, if all of creation, and from the book of Genesis, if all of creation is for man, then we still adjudicate that value based upon that hierarchy. So if we don't understand what the connection is, if we don't see it as intermediate, then we still respect that it is there. We just don't know how it is. And we're working on that assumption that there is that hierarchy, there is that dependency. So, for example, um, whales that dive very, very deep, they pick up a lot of plankton. They actually clean the environment and actually cycle through oxygen in the ocean in ways that we couldn't possibly have conceived of. Right. So if we let them go extinct, then we're actually damaging an environment that we need, the, the cleanliness of the oceans, the oxygenation of the oceans. We wouldn't know that. Right. So the expectation is, well, if we just found out about that, what else do we don't know? So let's be careful. Right. But ultimately, I think it is a species selfishness. If you want to put it in a pernicious way, it is because we assume we're at the top. We've been told we're at the top. It is for us, but that also means just as a parent, the children are for the parent is also for the children. You take care of what's given for you. We have that responsibility. Okay, very good. So I think that's we're a little bit over time. Okay, let's see. And Father Jim, would you like to close us in prayer? I would appreciate it.
Yes, yes. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Almighty God, you are the creator of all things, and all things are a gift. Lord, help us to appreciate the gifts you give to us and appreciate your love for us. All these gifts are in love. Lord, let us go forth now to celebrate in this season, especially the gift of your Son. Lord, let us proclaim his goodness and all creation towards your good. We ask and thank you for this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much for everyone for coming. Have a blessed Advent.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you next
Thank you,
semester.
Dr. Smith.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
So much, Dr. Tim. It was great.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, Sean.